My name is Ryan Rakshan, and I'm one of the co-founders at Midnight Ceramics. And today I'm going to be showing you how to apply our glazes to bisque. And along the way, we're going to talk about a lot of things, including test tiles and how to run a good test tile and how to use our test tiles that we post on our website to understand our glazes. I'm going to talk about actually applying a glaze to a pot, specifically with using brushes. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about firing pots, and we'll talk a little bit about firing and how you should properly fire our glazes. Alright everyone, so I have a whole bunch of stuff here to talk about. I've got two of our glazes from Midnight Ceramics. These are just two of our most popular ones. We've got Unicorn Skin, and I've got Sexy Mermaid. And I've also got some pots with those glazes on them, just as examples. And I've got some test tiles, so we can talk about how to make and read a test tile. I've got a few brushes, a sponge, and some water, and some blank pots that don't have any glaze on them yet. So the very first thing that I want to talk about is going to be test tiles. Now, when I make a test tile, I try to make sure that I have a vertically fired test tile. So anytime that I am firing my test tiles, I want to be able to see how much my glaze runs down the side of the test tile, right? So I want the test tile to be fired vertically so that if the glaze is going to run, it's going to move down the side. One of the next things that I want on my test tile is I want to use the same kind of clay that I usually use for my work. Now, our test tiles or our work at Midnight Ceramics, most of us that run the company use Little Loafers clay. So we tend to make most of our test tiles out of Little Loafers. That's a clay from Highwater. But just about any really bright or white stoneware will look just about the same with our glazes. Let's see. I do run red clay test tiles just so that I know what those will look like and so that I can post those on our website so you guys can understand that sort of thing. One of the next things that I want to have on my test tiles is a little bit of texture, right? Because I want to have some flat areas so that I can see how my glaze will look on the flat areas of my pots. And then I also want to have some little bit of texture so I can understand how my glaze will interact with the texture on the surface of my pot. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit more in just a moment. When I run my test tiles, I'll usually run 1, 2, and 3 layer test tiles, and I'll usually put those on the website. So we've got 1, 2, and 3 layers here. And as you all can see, with Sexy Mermaid specifically, with one layer there isn't really a whole lot of color. You don't get some of those like blue rivulets that really make Sexy Mermaid look the way that it's supposed to look. With 2 layers, we start to get those rivulets, and this would actually be a nice glaze. If you just wanted to use 2 layers, Sexy Mermaid would still be pretty nice glaze, right? Because we're going to have like quite a bit of variation there in the color. And then lastly, with 3 layers, we're really going to get that color to pop. Now, with this particular glaze, and with a lot of our glazes, this is going to be a little bit nerdy, just FYI, but with this particular glaze, we're utilizing something called phase separation, which is just where when your glaze becomes molten in the kiln, two of the types of glass that are molten in the kiln, they don't really get along with each other very well, kind of like oil and water in a pan, right? So we've got 2 different components in this glaze that are separating out from one another once they're molten. And as they separate out, they have different densities, and as light passes through them, you can bend the light from one color to another color. So with Sexy Mermaid specifically, we'll look at the back of this test tile, and there's all these rivulets of blue floating on that green background. The green is the pigment in the glaze, and then the blue is from the light being bent by the different densities of glass that have separated out from one another. So that's one of the things that really makes our glazes really interesting. But in order to get that phase separation to happen, all that interesting kind of rivulets and that character and depth in this glaze, you need to have it on thick enough. That being said, if you put this glaze on too thick, it will start to run. So a good test tile, like I said, will have a vertical surface area where the glaze is allowed to run. And if we look at the side of this test tile where there's no texture, so on the side of the test tile, the glaze is really permitted to run, and it ran a good ½ an inch, it looks like, because on the back we can see that that glaze really didn't come down all that way down there. So this glaze can run a little, like kind of a substantial amount if you get it on thick enough to where you're getting the right kind of color. That being said, I'm going to talk about feathering the glaze down on the bottom of your pot as you apply it, so we can get lots of glaze up here and a little bit of glaze down here, and then we can still get all those nice rivulets, but we don't have any running on the surface of the pot because we've feathered the glaze up, where we've got 3 layers on the top and maybe 2 layers on the bottom, and that glaze is permitted to run down and cover up that 2-layer section down on the bottom. Let's see. So that's most of what I want to talk about with these test tiles. Over here with unicorn skin, which is another one of our popular glazes, I've got 1, 2, and 3 layers with unicorn skin as well. And unicorn skin gets a little bit more opaque as the glaze gets thicker. So with this thin 1 layer, the glaze is a little bit transparent, where you can see the texture breaking through the glaze, and there's this clay showing through. And then as we get through to 2 layers, you can see a little bit less of that texture, but the glaze is running a little bit more down on the sides. We've got these kind of droplets building up. And then when we get to 3 layers, there's really not a whole lot of the base glaze that you can see underneath of the glaze. You can't see the clay underneath of the glaze. So that's an important thing to be looking for when you're looking at our test tiles on our website, is check to see how thick each tile is, and we'll have 1, 2, and 3 layer test tiles for all of our glazes on our website. And you're also going to want to look for the color of clay that you're using. So if you use a red clay, this is 3 layers of unicorn skin on a red clay, as opposed to 3 layers of unicorn skin on a white clay. And the glaze can be substantially different, where we get all kinds of tones of blue and brown in this one, and on the white clay we get more yellows and creamy shades. I have one more clay here that utilizes Sexy Mermaid. That's an Elan transfer in the middle with some clear over top. We're working on a clear at the moment, but we don't have it quite ready. Around the rim of this pot, though, we're using 112 clay. This is a Meg van der Linden Ironworks pottery pot. And on top of the 112 clay, which is a manganese speckled clay from Standard, we have unicorn skin. And the unicorn skin is different from either of these other 2 clays that we've used. So try to find a clay body on our website, or make a test tile so that you know what the glaze will look like on your pot. So that's test tiles. Test tiles are really useful. It really takes like 30 seconds. It takes almost no time at all. But for some reason, it's like pulling teeth to get a lot of people to run a test tile. And it's going to save you so much work, because after you've made a nice, beautiful pot, if you don't really know how the glaze behaves yet, if you haven't used it a few times, you might have trouble understanding how to apply it to that pot. I would also like to mention that we have overlap test tiles on our website as well. Some of our glazes have been designed in tandem with each other, so like for example Witching Hour and Unicorn Skin were designed together so that they look good over top of one another, and when we do something like that, we like to provide overlap test tiles for y'all to check out on our website. So one of the next things that I want to talk about before we start actually glazing our pots is I want to look at the pots themselves and understand what kind of glaze I want to put on this pot based on the pot. Now the first thing I'm going to look at is the texture on the pot, and I'm going to say, do I like the texture on the pot, or do I dislike the texture on the pot? Like, did I get my fingers all in it, or did I mess up when I was doing some stamping? And if I don't like the texture on the pot, I'm going to want to use one of our glazes that doesn't highlight texture well. So I have a few of those out here. I've got Spruce String Bean, which is a really cool glaze that has all these crystals growing in it, but this pot has those same ridges that this one does, but you can't see those ridges because the glaze has covered it all up, right? Especially when we get it on at 3 layers. Down at 2 layers, we might still be able to see some of those ridges, but with 3 layers up through here and down through there, you really can't see any of that stuff happening. One of our other glazes that might work well for that would be Canadian Tuxedo is another one that hides texture pretty well. And lastly, I've also got Witching Hour is another one of those glazes that really hides texture well. So it doesn't break on texture at all, where with a lot of black glazes, when you put them over the corner of your piece, you'll see that white clay coming through. But with Witching Hour, you can't see any of that. So this glaze really hides texture pretty well. So On the other hand, if I had texture that I did like if I wanted to show off this ridge that was going up the corner of the pot, I would pick one of my more transparent glazes, like maybe Boogeyman, which shows off that texture really well, or maybe this one is Spiderwort, which also shows off some of that texture pretty well. So it's important to think about texture when you're starting your pot, or when you're starting to glaze your pot. The next thing I want to look at is the foot of my pot. Now, when you look at a lot of professional potters' pots, they'll have some kind of foot on the bottom of the pot that will catch a little bit of glaze, especially if they're accustomed to using glazes that run a little bit. So on Meg's pot here, we have this indent that comes in that'll catch some glaze as it comes down, and on my pot we have this ledge that comes out. I have another pot over here by the wonderful Ann Hobart, and hers doesn't have that same sort of foot that's going to catch some glaze, which is fine. That just means that you have to use a less runny glaze when you're glazing a pot like this. And maybe you want to leave a little bit more room for that glaze to run. That being said, most glazes will run at least a little bit when you fire them to the correct temperature. Glazes that don't run at all sometimes are a little bit under fired, or sometimes you can have glazes that don't run at all, but they tend to be less interesting than glazes that run a little bit. So a lot of our glazes have just a little bit of movement to them, and that's how we get some of that phase separation and those rivulets that are happening in the glaze. So that's something to pay attention to. Is if your pot doesn't have a foot on it, it won't catch as much glaze and it won't save that pot. So like if we look over here at Spiderwort, we can see how this Spiderwort was running down the side of this pot, and then when it got down to the foot down in the bottom, that glaze pulls down in that foot and it holds it and keeps it from spilling over. Especially like right underneath of the handle. We're going to talk about handles in just a moment here. But underneath of the handle where that glaze pulls down and collects, if this were a pot with no foot, like if it didn't have this ledge down at the bottom like my pots do, this would have run down and hit the kiln shelf and it would have needed to be chiseled off, right? So let's talk about handles a little bit. On most surfaces of our pot, we've only got like one amount of surface area that's going to cover some glaze, or be covered with some glaze. So if I cover this part with glaze here, and this runs down, we've got 1 times the amount of glaze. Now, if we look at a handle, we've got the glaze that's on the pot itself, we've got the glaze that's on the inside of the handle, and we've got the glaze that's on the outside of the handle. So there's 3 times as much glaze above this point right here as anywhere else on the pot. And I'm going to pull in a pot here that did run. So this glaze has Sexy Mermaid on the bottom, and you can see I've had to grind it down just a little bit down in the corner right there. So something to think about is that you really want to make sure that you kind of taper the glaze up on your handle. You don't want to have too much glaze on your handle or the area around your handle, and you want to make sure that your glaze isn't going to run down there because it has a much greater potential to run on the bottom of the handle than anywhere else. Okay, so I think we're about ready to glaze one of these pots. I'm going to use Sexy Mermaid for this pot, and I can't stress enough, like, I'm a very technical sort of person. I'm the kind of person who likes to read directions, but you should probably read the directions when you use one of our glazes, because our glazes have a lot of depth to them, so they can be a little bit finicky, right? So like you'll notice that Sexy Mermaid specifically reads cone 5, and a lot of our other glazes read cone 5, cone 6. Sexy Mermaid can be really, really runny if you fire it too hot, and cone 6 tends to be just a little bit too hot for this glaze. One more thing that this will tell you on the back is that if you fire it and then you cool it down slowly, so if it's in a really heavily packed kiln, or if it's in a kiln that has a controlled cool on it, or a kiln that has like really thick bricks, what will happen is there are little crystals that will grow in the surface of this glaze, and they'll turn it this olive matte color instead of being kind of shiny and this greenish blue, right? So you'll know that from reading the back of this label, which is also on our website. You can read all that before you buy our glazes. So you want to read that before you apply things. It'll also tell you on the label how runny the glaze is. So I'll use terminology that starts at very stable, is our most stable glazes. I'll label them very stable. And then from there we say somewhat runny, and then from there it's runny, and then very runny. So Sexy Mermaid is labeled as a very runny glaze, and Unicorn Skin is probably a somewhat runny glaze, moderately runny. So this one's not very runny, whereas this one is. So we want to make sure that we're using this glaze on a pot that has a nice strong foot statement that will hold that glaze, and we want to taper it where we're adding more glaze to the top part than to the bottom part of our pot. And of course we want to make sure that we're really not adding too much to the handle area. As far as brushes that I like to use, at Midnight Ceramics we really like these like super inexpensive brushes that you can get from Home Depot or just about any hardware store. And they're just the disposable ones that are on the bottom shelf. They're like $1 a piece, and they're really wonderful. They do a great job. So we're going to shake this glaze really well before use. And I should mention that these glazes are not designed as dipping or pouring glazes. So I've seen some people who will pour their glaze into the inside of their pot and then pour it back into the container, and these glazes are not designed to be used that way. So I would really suggest against doing that. That'll add too much glaze to the surface of your pot. Okay, so we've got our pot. I'm just going to hold it by the foot, and I'm going to dip my brush in the glaze. I might want to get down to the bottom to make sure that there's no glaze that has settled out down on the bottom of the can, and there isn't. We're all good down there. And then with a really pretty wet brush, so you want this to flow as it goes onto the pot. So you don't want to kind of wipe too much of the glaze off of your brush. You want it to be pretty wet. And we're going to start with the inside of this pot, and we're just going to kind of smear that glaze around in there. Nice flowing coats so that it moves around as I'm glazing. And if I get any drips, I'm just going to try and spread those around on the surface. So it'll be a little bit easier to see once I do the outside of this pot. There we go. So I've got a nice even coat on the entire inside of this pot. Now, the first coat of glaze usually dries pretty quickly. And by the way, when we say that a glaze is drying, the glaze itself isn't actually drying. The water is soaking into the wall of the clay, right? So that's something that we have to pay attention to. When you're glazing your pots, if there's something that prevents the water from soaking into the wall of the clay, it'll prevent the glaze from sticking to the surface of the pot well. So you want to make sure that there's no dust on the outside of your pot before you start. You want to make sure there's no drips of wax. You want to make sure that you haven't washed that pot off recently. And if you've added lots and lots of glaze to one pot, all that water that's soaked into the wall of the pot will prevent more glaze from sticking. So you can see this band of yellow that's appearing down here on the outside of the pot. That's the thinnest area of the pot, and that's where the water from the inside glaze that we just applied has already soaked through the wall, and we can see it starting to dampen the outside wall of the pot. So that might come into play when we get to the outside of this pot. We'll talk about that yellow band and then how that'll affect our glaze adhering to that part of our pot. So I'm going to continue applying our second layer of glaze to the inside of this pot. Starting at the top and allowing gravity to pull the glaze down just a little bit, because again we're doing flowing coats of glaze, so there's going to be a little bit of dripping. Okay. So this coat is going to take a little bit longer to dry. It's going to stay kind of shiny for a longer period of time, and that's because there's already some water in the surface of the pot, and that water is blocking more water from getting into it. And we can see this band starting to get darker and wider on the outside of the pot where we're applying that glaze, right? So, once the inside of this pot is dry, I'm going to hold the pot from the inside with my fingers in here, and we'll be able to paint the entire outside of the pot. I'm going to let this sit for like maybe 5 to 10 minutes to give it a little bit more time to dry, and then I'll bring you guys back and we'll go ahead and paint the outside. Okay then everyone, so I've given this pot about 5 minutes to dry, maybe 10 minutes to dry, and we can see how the band down at the bottom here has dispersed somewhat, right? So that's that water moving through the clay a little bit. And the inside, the clay on the, or the glaze on the inside of the pot is totally dry now. Now I can still feel on the outside of this pot how it's a little bit cold. So we know that there's still some water inside of this clay. If we wanted to wait for all of the water to evaporate from the clay completely, we would have to wait several hours. But this will be good enough for right now. So since we've had this sitting for a little while, I'm going to kind of wash off my brush just a little bit, and we're going to close this back up and we'll give it a brief shake one more time. There we go. And we're going to go ahead and apply glaze to the outside of this pot. So here I want to show you guys what I mean by flowing brush strokes. When you apply the glaze to the pot, it should stay wet for kind of a long time, and it should be able, like, free to move around on the surface of the pot. And that's what I mean by a flowing brush stroke. You don't want, some people will kind of like wipe all of the glaze off of their brush and then they'll just kind of smear the tiniest little bit of glaze around on the pot like that. That's not what we want. We really want to put a big, wet, kind of goopy brush stroke of glaze on the pot. So we've done the top with one layer. Now we're going to do the middle of this pot, one layer. And once my brush dries out, I'm going to dip it again. There we go. Being sure to get in all the little crevices around the handle. I find that people who have more texture on their pots tend to put more glaze on their pots because they're trying to work that glaze down into that texture, right? So it can be dangerous where you get carried away a little bit and you're adding more and more glaze and you're trying to work it down into that texture. I'm going to show you guys a little bit of a trick for that in just a little bit here. And I'll switch over to holding the pot this way so I can get the bottom of the pot. And we'll dip again. And just coming right up to that transition between the pot and the foot. Now, I do this for two reasons. I do it for an aesthetic reason, and I do it for a running reason, right? So aesthetically, if you have the glaze end right where the pot ends and the foot begins, it kind of looks like you meant to do it that way. If you just pick an arbitrary line somewhere on the foot and glaze to that area, it's just like you kind of picked an arbitrary line and it doesn't really look very purposeful. But if you glaze, oops, we got some drips here, so I'm going to spread those out. If you glaze right to the area where your foot stops and your pot begins, or vice versa, you'll have a much nicer looking pot. Also, the glaze is way less likely to run right there. Okay, so we've done one layer on this whole pot. Somewhere in the middle, I would even say we've done about 2 layers. And I'm going to come back to the top and do another layer on the top of the pot. Oops, a bit of a drip there. I want to catch that and spread that around. There we go. Okay, and again, this second layer is going to take a little bit longer to dry than the first layer that we put on, because there's all of the water that we applied on the inside wall of the pot, and there's all of the water that we applied from our first coat on the top of this pot. And there's not as much room for water in the wall of the pot, so it's going to take a while for that glaze to kind of settle in. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to come back and do the handle. Now, I try to glaze handles pretty sparingly, right? I just want enough glaze on there to kind of make the pot look nice and make the pot not rough, so that when you grab it with your finger, it doesn't feel bad on your hands. But you don't want so much glaze that it's going to start to run at all, because handles really pull glaze down on the surface of a pot. So I really usually just do like 1 layer, maybe 2 layers on a handle, so that I don't risk that glaze running down and sticking to the kiln shelf underneath of the handle. Okay. So we've done one layer on our handle. We've done 2 layers on this top part here, maybe 2 layers in the middle, and 1 layer down on the bottom. I don't think I'm going to add any more glaze to the very bottom part of the pot here, because as the glaze melts, it's going to start to pull down over top of that 1 layer, and I want to leave some space for that glaze to run and pool down at the bottom of the pot. What I will do is I'll do another layer up on my texture up at the top here, right? Because that texture is going to slow down the running of the glaze a little bit anyways. That's why the sides of my test tiles have more runs than the front of my test tiles. Okay. Spread this down just a little bit so we get a little bit more glaze down on the bottom of the pot here. If you're doing a large flat surface, I like to go back and forth. So instead of going around and around and around, I might go around once for my first layer and then up and down for my second layer and then around for my third layer. Or if I were doing like a plate and I wanted to apply clear to the plate, I would go back and forth this way for 1 layer, and then I would go back and forth this way for the next layer, and then for my final layer I would go back and forth this way again. And that just keeps things kind of even on the surface of the pot. That being said, if you're noticing a lot of brush strokes on your pot, and for the most part our glazes, if you have brush strokes on the surface of the pot, they'll melt in. We have a few glazes that don't do that. Witching Hour in particular, you can still see the brush strokes after you've fired the pot. But what you can do is after the pot is totally dry, so I would normally wait like an hour or so for this, you can come back and rub the surface of the pot. And as you're rubbing it, you're kind of working down those peaks into the valleys and kind of changing the way that the glaze is applied to the pot. I'm just making it kind of nice and even. So that's applying 1 glaze to 1 pot. I can talk a little bit about glaze defects as well, specifically trouble that you might run into while you're applying glaze to a pot. The biggest one that I tend to see is called crawling. And with crawling, what happens is people are applying way too much glaze to their pot, or for whatever reason, the water from the glaze isn't able to soak into the clay. So if it takes more than like a couple minutes for your pots to be dry enough that you can touch them, then there's probably too much water in the wall of the pot, or there's wax there, or there's like oil on the surface of the pot there, or maybe dust. And what can happen is as the glaze dries, instead of the glaze drying and shrinking and adhering to the pot rather than shrinking in, it'll shrink sideways because it's going to dry very, very slowly and water kind of has to evaporate from it slowly. And as it shrinks sideways, you might get these little cracks in the surface of your pot, right? And those little cracks that are in the surface of the glaze on the surface of the pot, those little cracks, when they go into the kiln and they start to kind of melt, they'll peel apart and you'll get these big bare sections of pot where there's no glaze whatsoever on that section of the pot. And that defect is called crawling, right? Crawling is very different from crazing. I'd like to talk about crazing a little bit as well. There is just the tiniest little bit of crazing down at the bottom of this boogeyman pot where there are these cracks in the surface of the glaze that go laterally there. So crawling happens when you're applying the glaze to the pot, right? Because the water isn't able to soak into the wall of the pot. Crazing happens when the glaze is cooling back down after it's been fired and it becomes solidified, right? So crazing, a lot of people will tell you that crazing is caused by unloading your kiln too quickly, which is actually not true. A pot that crazes when you unload a kiln when it's too hot would also craze if you unloaded that kiln at room temperature and then waited a couple months. That same pot that crazed when you unloaded it hot will craze over time, right? You're just speeding up that process by unloading the kiln hot. Crazing is caused by a difference in coefficient of thermal expansion between the glaze and the clay. So if your glaze, well, before we go into that, let's talk about what coefficient of thermal expansion is. Coefficient of thermal expansion is the thing that affects everything in the universe, where as you heat things up, they expand, and as you cool things down, they contract. And the higher the coefficient of thermal expansion, the more that something will expand and contract, and the lower, the less that it will expand and contract. So when your glaze crazes, that just means that the glaze has a higher coefficient of thermal expansion, so it's expanding and contracting more than the clay itself. Um, there's varying opinions on like whether this is food safe or not. I personally find it to be pretty food safe. Like there's a lot of pots that are sold by major retailers that have this sort of effect on them, and nobody seems to worry about it. The big thing that I would say is like if you're gonna make a pot and it's got crazing on it, I wouldn't store like raw chicken in it and then briefly hand wash it and then drink coffee out of it, right? Because all of the nasty bacteria and salmonella from that raw chicken will get stuck in those little crazes. But for the most part, I don't worry about it. Like this is a coffee cup, I will drink coffee out of this no problem and not worry about the crazing and bacteria and stuff like that. It's not a thing that I am particularly concerned with. And I run things through the dishwasher, so they're usually pretty clean. Um, let's see. So I think that's about it for applying a glaze to a pot. You might want to come back, and if you got some glaze that was a little bit too low here after you've applied the glaze, you can either use like a fingernail or a rib to scrape that off, or if you prefer, you can come back with a sponge, and you want to use just a barely damp sponge, and we can kind of wipe that glaze back a little bit. And again, if you don't know how a glaze is going to behave, make sure that you run a test towel or a test pot so that you can understand how that glaze is going to behave in the kiln. Now, I know this glaze pretty well because I have my test towels and I've used it several times. So I know that if I've used one layer, it's going to look more or less like that. Two layers, so probably the bottom of the pot is going to look a little bit more like this test towel here. And then the vast majority of the pot is going to look like this test towel, where I've got 2 to 3 layers on. Definitely the middle of the pot has 3 layers. The top of the pot probably has 2 layers, but that second one was a little bit thick, so my pot's probably going to look like this one here. So that's what I got. Make sure you clean out your brushes when you're done and screw on the lids tightly. And yeah, when you fire, make sure to read the cone number on the side of the label and make sure to read the instructions themselves. So we fire this glaze to cone 5 and it works just fine. In my 2.5-inch brick kilns, which is the vast majority of kilns have 2.5-inch bricks, the glaze will look like this. If I put the glaze into a kiln with 3-inch bricks or a kiln that's really heavily loaded that's going to cool slowly, I get more of an olive color coming out, which is still nice, but it's a little bit different from this particular color.
So I'd like to thank you all for joining me today, and I hope that you all learned something new about how to apply a glaze to a pot or about how glazes behave in the kiln. Hopefully there was some little tidbit even for some of the more advanced potters out there. And I would love to encourage you guys to follow us on social media. We are at Midnight Ceramics on Instagram, and we have a Facebook page, Midnight Ceramics. And also you can check out our website, midnightceramics.com. And if you like anything you see, feel free to order. Most of our glazes fire to cone 5 or cone 6, and I like to think that they're really unique and different from some of the other stuff that's out there. So again, thank you guys so much, and I hope that you all stay safe and healthy, and maybe we'll hear from you soon.